Revolutionary Wars of France, 1792 through 1796. When one thinks of the French Revolution and the reasons for which it came about, what likely comes to mind is the popular images of the storming of the Bastille on 14 July 1789,
Bye-bye, boy.
Have fun storming the castle.
Think it'll work?
Bye-bye.
brought on by the public's refusal to submit to the excesses of royal privileges.
Let them eat cake.
The culmination of this public outrage and revolutionary fervor was the Reign of Terror, which ran from 1793 to the summer of 1794, where anybody,
Off with his head!
and I do mean anybody, could lose their head, even the king.
Off with his head!
There are many other reasons, however, such as the economic crisis in France brought on by the near century of constant war, the loss of colonial possessions with no compensation, and the general mismanagement by royal prerogative. The very famous result of the French Revolution was the rise of Napoleon, the Empire of France, and many more years of wide-ranging wars, mostly successful, but ultimately leading to the defeat of Napoleon, his exile, and the death of the Revolution. Sort of. However, we are not here to talk about the French Revolution, why it came about, or its social impact on contemporary or future events. Nor are we here to talk about the story of Napoleon, which has been told by far better scholars than I. We are here to discuss how the Revolution survived until Napoleon arose to become the great wartime leader that he was. The Revolutionary Wars of France begin in 1792, and Napoleon has a part to play as early as 1793 with the Siege of Toulon. After this successful debut, Napoleon suffered disfavor, but continued to serve in positions of increasing responsibility until 1796, when he is given command of the Army of Italy. Our discussion of Napoleon will end here. How the revolution survived before this is our focus, so we will discuss what happened from the first declaration of war in April 1792 until the Treaty of Campo Formio in October of 1797, which ended the War of the First Coalition and the first portion of France's Revolutionary Wars. Before we discuss French fortunes on the battlefield, we must look at how French armies of the time fought. The French 1791 Manual for the Training and Maneuvers of Infantry formed the basis for the organization of French infantry in the Revolutionary Wars and into the Napoleonic period. This document was heavily influenced by General Jacques-Antoine de Guibert, who theorized many military concepts that would be implemented during the French Revolution, namely mass conscription and various infantry maneuvers such as light infantry doctrine and streamlined line and column fighting techniques for the infantry. The 1791 French Infantry Battalion was the main tactical unit, and it included 8 line infantry companies and 1 grenadier infantry company, each of approximately 120 men, but in practice 80 to 100 men per company was a more achievable figure. The grenadier company was usually detached, leaving the 8 line companies to work in concert with each other. The light infantry could perform in a standard line of battle just like regular line infantry, but they were expected to move dispersed and fire independently. Advancing before the standard line, light infantry could conduct reconnaissance moving forward, feeling out exactly where the enemy was located before the main infantry force engaged. The light infantry was also expected to pester the enemy forces with constant and independent fire from dispersed formations. The French model planned for 2 soldiers to work together, one firing while the other reloaded, but this rarely happened in the chaos of the Revolutionary Wars. Depicted here is a stylized example of this dispersed formation, and you can see how it would be much more difficult to hit these soldiers with the firearms of the day. Usually, cold steel was the only way to get rid of well-handled light infantry, but the light infantry could also move faster than the regular infantry, so it was not as easy as it sounds. For line infantry, the normal formation during tactical movement was the open column. From this formation, the battalion could form line quickly to the left or the right, but was slower, forming a frontal line for combat. The frontal line could be formed in a variety of ways, but the normal method was forming a line to the right, which is shown here. As you can see, this required training, practice, and time. Terrain also played a large role in how quickly and how well the line could be formed. Later French armies would be able to handle these difficult maneuvers in rough terrain and under fire, as could the forces of the monarchy before the Revolution. The volunteers of the revolutionary armies could not. As such, the column rather than the line was used most often because it was easier to maintain formation with inexperienced troops, and it relied on the bayonet charge more than musket firepower. It did tend to suffer more casualties due to the closely packed formation from both musket fire and artillery, and it was also relatively ineffective against well-trained troops. But the power of a column charged with cold steel was a terrifying spectacle and capitalized on the French spirit of élan. To support this, different column formations were used, such as the closed column shown here. This eliminated the spaces between the companies, which made it harder to move laterally, but slightly faster to form line of battle ahead and more resilient against a cavalry charge. It also increased the number of casualties taken due to the closely packed companies, but also increased the hitting power when the column hit the enemy line. A more sophisticated column type was the double closed column, which came directly from Guibert's theories. This column was easy to handle, quicker to form line, and could move faster and hit harder. It was a formation that enabled a quick forming of a square to repel cavalry, and it became the most common French formation throughout the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, even with the much better trained units of the future. A further extrapolation of these formations on a grand scale was the mixed order tactic, where one battalion would be in a normal line formation using 7 of its normal 8 line companies. Flanking this line would be 2 other battalions in a tight column formation, also of 7 companies. One company from each battalion would be formed as light infantry and screen the formation, and the grenadier companies of each battalion would serve as immediate support to the skirmishers out front. With all the nations of these conflicts being composed of similar units of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, the French advantage was the application of these practices more systematically across all of their formations. The column movements just described made the French infantry more mobile on the battlefield. The French light infantry was incorporated to a greater degree than other nations, and the Gribeauval artillery system, which was developed in 1765, standardized French artillery and made it lighter and more accurate. More than any other arm of the military, it was the artillery that saved the revolution. Is there any wonder, then, that Napoleon, an artilleryman himself, rose to prominence? Upon the declaration of war in April of 1792, France faced threats along each of its landward borders. France formed 3 armies to oppose the Austrians in the Austrian Netherlands and the natural invasion routes across the Rhine River. The armies were commanded by generals named Lafayette, Rochambeau, and Luckner. All were experienced generals trained in the French Royal Army. Lafayette and Rochambeau had served in the American Revolutionary War, and both were present at the Battle of Yorktown. These efforts were short-lived. All 3 of these armies advanced with their inexperienced forces, met Austrian resistance, and either stopped in place or returned to France. This did not satisfy the revolutionary leaders in Paris. These generals were professionals, and they were complaining about inexperienced troops, inadequate logistics, and unrealistic orders to no avail. Only loyalty to the revolution and immediate defeat of her enemies could be tolerated. Therefore, Lafayette defected to the Austrians, where he was imprisoned. Rochambeau was allowed to retire unscathed, and Luckner went to the guillotine. This set the tone for generals in the near future: win or else. The French forces were more successful on other fronts. The French managed to stop any incursions from the Piedmontese region of Savoy in the south of France, and the Spaniards remained stalemated coming out of the Pyrenees. It was the northern and eastern fronts that were the most important, however, and soon Austria's ally Prussia invaded and swiftly took Verdun and Longwy on their way to Paris. The 3 French armies on this front had been combined into 2 new armies, one of which was under the command of General Charles Dumouriez, and the other under the command of General Francois Kellerman. These armies confronted the Prussians at Valmy on 20 September 1792. This battle is said to have saved the revolution, but it was more of a demonstration than a battle. The armies of Dumouriez and Kellerman combined as the Prussians, bolstered by Austrian reinforcements, continued moving west towards Paris. The French forces approached from the Prussian north and ended up east of them as the two sides attempted to make contact with each other. It was Kellerman who took the position around Valmy and the famous windmill which stands so prominently in the Émile Vernet painting from 1826. On the battlefield, Kellerman had it dismantled so the Prussians could not use it as an aiming marker for their artillery. Dumouriez moved up on Kellerman's right, and the combined French force of approximately 32,000 soldiers faced the Austrian-Prussian force under the Duke of Brunswick, which numbered about 35,000. The French artillery had been the arm of the military that had been least affected by the chaos of the Revolution, and they were about to show what they could do. Kellerman massed 40 cannons around the remains of the Valmy windmill, and they began to duel with the 60 Prussian cannons to the west. Unfortunately, Kellerman also massed too many troops in wagons in the area, and it wasn't long before Kellerman's horse was shot out from under him and a shell ignited a powder wagon. Seeing the resulting confusion, the Prussians began an infantry advance. Kellerman, worrying that his inexperienced volunteers could not stand against the Prussian infantry, sought to embolden the French soldiers by putting his hat on the tip of his sword, rising up in his stirrups, and shouting, "Vive la nation!" The French soldiers replied with "Vive la nation" and "Vive la France!" This display of French fortitude, coupled with the terrific cannonade, halted the Prussian infantry, and the Duke of Brunswick decided to withdraw. Hardly any casualties were taken on either side, less than 1,000 combined, but the green French troops had witnessed the vaunted Prussian infantry turn tail and retreat. Also, the only credible threat to Paris in 1792 was soon retreating back across the Rhine. Dumouriez would follow this symbolic victory with a real victory further north around the city of Mons in the Austrian Netherlands on 6 November 1792. After Valmy, Dumouriez was free to return to the north, and he wasted no time in breaking the Austrian siege of the city of Lille and preparing to invade the Austrian Netherlands. He concentrated his forces around the French city of Valenciennes and planned to move via the Austrian city of Mons on his way to the capital of Brussels. The Austrian forces were strung out all along the border, which allowed Dumouriez to have superiority of numbers on his chosen route. Contact between the two forces was made in the villages on the western outskirts of Mons, Jemappes on the French left, Couëmes in the center, and Berthemont on the French right. Dumouriez's 40,000 Frenchmen faced only 14,000 Austrians, although the Austrians did have a healthy artillery contingent of approximately 50 guns. The French numbers did not guarantee success. Dumouriez planned an attack on each flank, coupled with the main attack in the center. These attacks were not coordinated very well, which enabled the Austrians to defeat each attack before the other attacks took place. The overwhelming French numbers eventually began to take its toll, however. The French attack in the center was eventually successful, as was the flanking attack on the French right, and the Austrians were forced to retreat, giving the victory to the French. This painting of the battle by Émile Vernet in 1821 gives a sense of French line and column formations going into battle. On the face of things, it wasn't much of a victory, with the French suffering more casualties than the outnumbered Austrians. However, in the context of 1792 revolutionary France, the victory was significant. Following on the heels of the defensive victory at Valmy, where the inexperienced patriot soldiers of France had defeated the trained legions of Prussia, now here was an offensive victory against the veteran Austrians. This gave confidence to the revolutionary government in Paris and set the tone for the aggressive French maneuver techniques going forward. 1792 came to an end, but the revolutionary wars of France would continue.